Everyone knows Professor X as being the face of mutant politics, the good guy with an idealistic dream that mutants and humans can live together. But a lot of the times, that can be further from the truth. I think it's the Fox movies that really popularized this representation of Professor X, because in these films, he's a direct contrast to Magneto. Magneto's kind of the evil guy who knows his dream of mutant coexistence can never happen, so he has to take it to extreme measures. Whereas Charles is an optimist, he believes in an essentially hopeless dream, but he's the kind of guy who will still try to make it a reality. And that's what I think the general population thinks Charles is usually like, but a lot of the time, he's really not. Let's go back to the 60s when Charles was first created. Now, the comics in the 60s were definitely a product of their time, but it doesn't excuse the fact that he initially started off essentially as a pervert. Now, I wish I could say I was joking, but I'm not really, because in the first few issues, it's shown that Xavier has feelings for Jean, and the only reason he doesn't act on them is because he feels he has no right because he's in a wheelchair, rather than the fact that he's essentially a father figure and teacher to them. Now, it's up for debate whether he's actually 20 or 45 in this scenario, but I don't really know if it makes it any better. Yes, the 60s comics were almost seen as a joke in the time. They were just fun little stories, not meant to be taken too seriously. But that doesn't take away from the fact that he had a crush on one of his students, he repeatedly mind-wiped people and manipulated them for his own benefit, so essentially abusing his powers, and that's all without mentioning he was quite literally sending teenagers into Mortal Kombat to achieve his dreams. Now, the OG X-Men run wasn't too popular at the time. It was eventually cancelled after a few issues, but in the 70s, it was rebooted under Chris Claremont, and this is the iconic X-Men run. It created all our favourite characters, and this is where Charles changed a bit and was still very flawed, but he was no longer really a pervert, at least from what we saw. Now, across Claremont's time on the book, he wrote it for many years, nearly wrote 200 issues, and in this time, Xavier was essentially the overprotective father who didn't want to let go. There was now a new team of X-Men, and Cyclops and Storm had really developed into their own leaders, so they no longer truly needed Xavier, but I feel like Xavier really had a hard time taking this, and he eventually took on a new team of the New Mutants, and this was a lot different to how he handled the OG5. He was a lot more protective, didn't want them to get in as much danger, and he also didn't want Kitty to stay in the team. And this led to the iconic panel with Professor Xavier's a jerk, but he eventually allowed her to stay in the team after realizing that she'd earned her place. He was also very naive and stubborn almost, because he had fallen in love with the Shi'ar Empress Lilandra, and rather than going to live in love in the stars and enjoy his life, he always feared for his X-Men when they really didn't need him. Claremont himself had even said that Xavier was such a saintly character to him that he essentially got bored of writing him and didn't know what stories to put him in. So in issue 200, Xavier was presumed dead and he was written out of the book for a while. And Claremont was a lot more interested in writing Magneto, and Magneto struggled to be a new man and leading the X-Men. Now, this area of Xavier had its flaws, but he was narratively meant to be a good guy who was just a bit naive and stubborn at times. But from then on, after Claremont left the book, it seemed like writers purely just wanted to massacre Charles's character, because he just did unspeakable things and was no better than Magneto, and probably worse at times. Now let's start with the fact that a few years later, Xavier's conscience quite literally formed with Magneto and manifested itself into the villain Onslaught, which shows that Xavier was never really just a saintly, good, wholehearted man. A few years later, it's also discovered that he sent a group of new young mutants to rescue the OG5 at a deadly island of Krakoa, and they all died. So he mind-wiped everyone, and no one heard of it until many years later, and one of those people was actually Cyclops' brother Vulcan. And a few years later, he decided to form the new team, which actually succeeded in the mission. They didn't all die, except Thunderbird, rest in peace, and just moved on as if nothing happened. It would quite literally be like the man who raised you as a father figure from your teen years, sending you off to Mortal Kombat, getting you captured, and then getting your brother and a group of other mutants, getting them killed, and never telling you it happened. And this eventually led Cyclops to leaving Xavier because he was one of his most loyal followers, but that's just something that he couldn't forgive at the time. And that's probably not the worst of it. Later on in the Krakoan era, Charles quite literally sent groups of X-Men on suicide missions purely because they could be revived. So whether you view that as wrong or not, I think if you're sending the people you've essentially fathered since young on suicide missions with the intention of reviving them, you clearly have no care for what they do, and maybe it's for mutant kind, but I wouldn't do that. And there's so many more things that he's done. He has something called the Xavier Protocols, where he created a comprehensive file on literally how to kill every single member of the X-Men in case they ever went rogue. Now, the question I have is, was Professor X ever really a good guy? Well, I think he was intended to be written as a good guy, but in the 60s, he was already essentially a pervert. In the 70s, he was the annoying father who wouldn't let anyone grow into their own person. And then after that, he was essentially just written to be completely evil at times. But I guess we all have that one weird, creepy uncle. If you enjoyed, subscribe, check out the podcast with my friend, and yeah, more videos coming soon.